For the Wild podcast is brought to you in part by support from our partner, the Calliopeia Foundation. Calliopeia honors all life as sacred and works to heal today's issues at their root causes. Calliopeia partners with many projects around a common vision for a future built with love, reverence, and responsibility for our shared home. We are so grateful for Calliopeia's generous support to bring so many inspiring projects to life and for making our show possible every week.
Hey for the Wild community, Ayana here. I want to take a moment to thank the city of Bend, Oregon for generously supporting our work. The Deschutes River winds through the town of Bend and is home to rainbow trout, steelhead, chinook, and sockeye salmon, which are being co-restored by the Wasco, Tenino, and Paiute tribes. Historically, dip netting has been prominent along the Deschutes to harvest fish and is a technique still used today. Over millennia, the water draining from the Cascade Range has carved stunning canyons and rock sculptures along the body of this river, renowned for whitewater rafting. If you visit Bend, we invite you to take the time to visit the water and meditate on the stories it holds. At For the Wild, we're passionate about connecting with water, land, and supporting local economies. We're honored to be collaborating with Bend to spread the word about Pledge for the Wild, a group of mountain towns that support responsible tourism through the preservation of land. Consider supporting and visiting one of my favorite destinations, Bend, Oregon, and help protect the land by giving back at pledgewildbend.com.
What happens when we allow our work to really fill us with this deep pleasure and deep joy and deep gratification? And what happens when we get out of this white supremacist paradigm of capitalism and productivity, and what happens when our work can feel good to us?
Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Pavini Moray, where we'll be digging deeper into the topics of pleasure and embodiment, wild love, and relational belonging. Pavini Moray, pronoun P, is a somatic sex therapist and ancestral lineage healing practitioner in private practice in San Francisco. Pavini works with individuals and couples who wish to resolve the past, inhabit their bodies and their pleasure, and speak their desires. Pavini is also the founder of Wellcelium, an online sexuality and intimacy school committed to personal and planetary liberation. Pavini hosts a podcast called Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magick, and Science. The podcast is released every new and full moon and addresses topics of transgenerational trauma, erotic wellness, and ancestral support. As a queer trans witch, Pavini walks the glitter path of dancing bones, ridiculous delight, and old magic. Well, thank you for coming back on the show. Our conversation, it really moved me, and being an activist for, a good chunk of time at this point and fighting resource extraction projects and campaigning and all this stuff, and feeling like, wow, we're not going to turn this boat around. We're not actually doing the things that 5 years ago I thought we were going to do. And then coming to this place of being like, wow, this is actually, the healing is really about relationships. And it's not about these other things that I thought it was. Not to say I'm going to stop fighting resource extraction projects, but it's so much more personal than that. And so having this conversation has felt really regenerative for me and clarifying, I guess, and also very comforting, because it's just like, oh, okay, I can land here. I can land in this conversation with you, and it feels real, and it feels like we're actually talking about these huge pieces that are really stopping us from being able to show up as allies and earth defenders in a way that I hope we can be one day, as even if it's only 3% of us. I'm not hoping for all of us. I think 3% to start a revolution or something. So I just wanted to start with that moment of gratitude for you.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciated our conversation yesterday as well.
I'm also thinking about what it means to investigate the inner spaces between the living and the dead within a culture that propagates death, while simultaneously seeding discomfort within the realms of death, darkness, the mystical, and the unseen. So I'm wondering, how does the process of journeying into the deep histories of our ancestors overlap with a reckoning around our mortality, a reclamation of death, or even a greater healing of the natural cycle of life.
It's my sense that there's a comfort when we connect with our ancestors, that there's a comfort in knowing that we will be welcomed when we die. And that, I think a lot about this idea of that we're the ones right now, and that I'm just thinking about like when we were in our 20s. I don't know if you ever felt like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with my life? What's my purpose? Right. And it seems like such a singular question. It seems like, oh, it's about me in this body in this life. And in some ways it is, but in some ways it's also a continuation of whatever is moving through the lineage, right? It's that the lineage is about something. And so when we're the ones right now, we're the ones doing the work right now for the sake of the lineage, for the sake of whatever the purpose of this lineage is, right? And that our descendants of blood and of hearts will follow after us, and will take up those threads of the work, even if it looks really, really different, right? Even if their manifestation of it is really different. And so like, for me, when I start to hold it in that way of, I'm just the one right now, I'm part of this greater thing. Death is not finite. It's not an ending. Rather, it's an initiation into just a different state of being in which I get to participate in life in a different way, right? I think about how I say prayers I have kids, and so I say prayers for my kids all the time. And I say prayers for their kids who aren't here yet, and maybe they'll never have kids, but like any ones who come after, I'm saying those prayers for. And I know because I'm doing this, and because it spontaneously just started, right? Like we think about this, like that the ones who came before me said those prayers for me, even though they didn't know that I would ever exist. And so there's just this comfort in holding this kind of worldview on it, I think, of this cosmology of just being part of something that continues on and on. And so we feel the ones, kind of how we orient in Western culture, is that the past is at our back and the future is in front of us. And so we feel the ones behind us and we feel the ones in front of us. And it becomes less personal in certain ways, of this question about like, what's my purpose? Like you might not even, like let me just say, I was in the shower. This was maybe a year ago. I was in the shower and I was asking my ancestors, I was like, really, like, folks, am I doing the thing? Am I like, what am I supposed to do? Is there anything else that you want me to do? And they were like, oh, you already did it. But I was like, well, do I get to know what it is? And they were like, nope. And it was just kind of like, oh, okay. So there's meaning to our lives, whether or not we, figure it out, and figuring it out being that like kind of intellectual concept. And so like, yeah, I mean, I think that death just becomes held in a different way, and, just anticipating kind of that welcoming of like, oh, I'm just in a different state now. Like I just moved to North Carolina. I'm in a different state now. And oh, I just died. I'm in a different state now. And I had the privilege of interviewing my friend Colleen 8 days before she died. She knew she was going to die. And she was like, yeah, I'm not scared. I'm not scared of this dying thing. I'm scared of not having lived. And kind of like the comings and the goings of being incarnate and being embodied, and then being disincarnate and being disembodied in a, not in the like trauma way, but in the like spirit way. Yeah. So I just kind of hold it as just in that, I guess the other metaphor I want to talk about is forests. And this will probably resonate with you, of like how necessary death is for forests, right? That the nutrients that when a tree or when a plant dies, how they return those to the soil, and how that becomes the nourishment for the next generation of life. Like it's just so cyclical. And yeah, I hold it that, while death is a mystery, it's natural and normal. And we can learn to really honor that, that while we're in these bodies, we have these bodies, and also trust that as we decompose and disintegrate and become one with the earth again, like that the earth of our bodies like goes back to our final lover. There's not this finite quality, right? It's only finite if we hold ourselves as separate and other than.
I was feeling into that so much. And Something that I've learned from Stephen Jenkinson, who we've had a few times on the show, who wrote a book called Die Wise, is that in order to die well, we have to live well. And we have to be not necessarily preparing for death, but in a way, it is a type of preparation for when we transition into something else, and how our relationships and the way that we live each day actually does affect the way that we transition into death. And that was something that was really, I don't know if shocking is the right word, but goodness, just surprising to me, because I'd never thought of it in that way. But I'd like to explore more of your thinking around pleasure, sexual wellness, and the erotic. And there's been a surge of conversation within our communities on these topics. And I think it might be useful if you shared a little bit more about how you defined and understand the quote erotic, and how we can understand pleasure both within and beyond the realm of sex.
Oh, such good questions. Yeah. I mean, really, when I try to put a word definition on the erotic, because it's a felt sense thing, it's a communion thing, right? It's hard to put words on it, but really I think the best word for it is aliveness, right? The current of life. And when we're really exquisitely aware of, all of the life that's happening in us at every single moment, right? That we're made up of, I don't know, I can't remember how many billion cells, some enormous number of cells, and each one of them is alive and has its own job, has its own purpose, has its own life cycle. And there's all these like processes of life happening on the cellular level, right? As a cell is born, a cell goes through its whole spiel, respires, reproduces, ultimately dies and is reabsorbed or, passed through. And so I think about the erotic, I'm like, oh, how can I start to pay attention to feeling that? To feeling into the life that's actually happening in this body, this like all of the collection of beings that is this body, and that it's a force. Eros is a force that is a current. Maybe it's a better word because I don't like the word force, but like a current it requires our attention. It's happening, right? Like a river is flowing, whether or not we're looking at it. And it's the same with Eros of it's there, whether or not we're paying attention to it. But the way to know it, the way to really know the erotic is through the attention and through the felt sense. And I discern it from the sexual, and that they're interwoven and they're connected, but they're not the same thing, right? There's so many ways to weave the erotic into your daily life. You might not just be able to have sex all day, right? But you can be erotic all day long, and you can be feeling your aliveness and feeling deeply all day long. And when your attention wanders, you can bring it back to your feeling. And so that the uniqueness of that sensation of really acknowledging the erotic, the field of the erotic, it's really profound, and it's like sourced both in those processes of life, but it's also sourced in all of the processes of life, right? This is the thing where we can get really turned on looking at the full moon or watching the wind blow through the top of the trees, through the leaves. Or I love that dance actually of like, I was dancing in the Mission in San Francisco a while ago, and it's like, it's gritty, it's urban, and there's not a lot of nature. And I was looking out the window, and there's these palm trees that go all the way down Mission Street, and they're really, really tall. So it's just like this long, thin trunk. And at the top, there's this kind of burst of foliage. And I was watching the wind move through those leaves, those palm leaves, those fronds, I guess they're called. And I was like, oh, like that's sexy. Like, it's not just sexy to me because I'm watching it. I'm like, oh, that whole thing that's happening between them. It was like watching two lovers, right? Mm-hmm. Of like, oh, the wind is tickling those fronds and the fronds are combing the wind. And it's like this reciprocal relationship. And I'm getting to watch porn right here. And, so I would say that's how I hold the erotic. And it's just the current of life that we can tune our attention towards. And pleasure is just this boon that we get to enjoy, right? It is about enjoyment. It's about savoring. It's about delight. It's about feeling good. And one of the things that can happen with trauma is that feeling good cannot feel good anymore. It can feel bad, or it can feel unsafe. And So I also want to just be really clear that pleasure is a very personally defined experience. I can't tell you what your pleasure is, it's yours, and you can't tell me what mine is. It's really, what feels good, what feels safe enough. It can be a kind of quiet, savoring, enjoying, and it can also be like more exciting, just depending on the chemical experience that our nervous system's having at that moment, the kind of the unique combination of excitement and enjoyment, or arousal and calming, or sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. But I think that I also think about pleasure as something that is really healing, and that deliberately allowing pleasure, whatever that is for you, or whatever your definition is, deliberately allowing pleasure to infiltrate, to be this like agent provocateur inside your body of like really allowing the pleasure to come in, it's the antithesis of this unworthiness syndrome that plagues us, right, in the West, of disconnect and feeling like we're too much, or we're not enough, or we're unworthy of goodness and love and blessing. And so like, yeah. And I just want to note that the ancestral practices can really help with this. I talk with my ancestors a lot in the shower, and what a miracle is, like, hot water comes out of the wall in my house. That's a miracle, And so I'm like, I get in the shower and I'm like, oh, you guys feel this? This is so good. It feels so good. And, that kind of pleasure of finding what calls you to spirit, what opens your heart, what fills you with delight, what makes you feel free and spontaneous. Those are kind of the ways that I hold pleasure. And just that if I think our movements are often really serious. We're committed to the good work. I made a film a few years ago called Holy MILF, which was a queer, ecosexual, erotic ritual invocation to the elements film. And I was showing it to a bunch of activists, and one of the folks there was like, yeah, that's great, Pavini, but forest defending, that's what we have to do. It's really important. I was like, yeah, but this is the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's just through a different lens. It's what happens when we allow our work to really fill us with this deep pleasure and deep joy and deep gratification. And what happens when we get out of this white supremacist paradigm of capitalism and productivity, and like what happens when our work can feel good to us.
I was looking down the road at a lily, 100 miles past the end of the highway. In my mind their leaves were all swaying together, their feet down under the water. And I wanted the chorus to join in, lay my mind under that cottonwood line. A lily forming a riddle for my mind, the one place that I thought I could try. I was looking down that straightway, cutting the horizon side. Swear I walked the new world down that four corner line. So I followed that soft illusion She guards the stairway that would take me up and up. Lilies dancing on the skyline.
Especially for those of us who are activists, for those of us who are really enraptured by the work. It's hard work. It's challenging on our bodies, on our minds, and to be able to find ways of feeling pleasure, feeling joy in the work, it honestly feels mandatory to continue doing it for the long haul. And I also loved what you said about the erotic. For those of us who can't have sex all day long, that it's nice to be able to know that we can still tap into that energy field. It doesn't have to be sexual. It can be something that's enlivening in a way because we have bodies and we have feelings and how to work with that within ourselves. And I don't think it has to be something that is projected onto others. And I think that can be where things can get messy. We can hold the erotic within ourselves and within the earth body. It feels so enlivening. So I'm super happy that you spoke to that. And also I wanted to, in response, read this quote by Audre Lorde from Uses of the Erotic, quote, "That self-connection shared is a measure of the joy which I know myself to be capable of feeling, a reminder of my capacity for feeling. And that deep and irreplaceable knowledge of my capacity for joy comes to demand from all of my life that is to be lived within the knowledge that such satisfaction is possible. It does not have to be called marriage, nor God, nor an afterlife," end quote.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to deepen this discussion, I want to turn towards a post that Pinar of Queer Nature recently shared, importantly naming the way pleasure remains relegated within the realm of the human. They write, quote, "Our ecological kin awaits our inquiries of consent, our listening, our engagement on this earth with them," end quote. So with these words in mind, I'm excited to think about how the erotic might expand our capacity for connection with place, or perhaps how we might re-engage with Earth as a loved one, a sacred relationship that is tended, savored, and pleasurable. And you kind of started to speak to that, I think, with watching the branches, but I'd love to go into this deeper.
Yeah, the ecosexual. Yeah, I want to start just by sharing a helpful tip to combat sexual socialization of like, how do we be with the erotic in consensual ways, but also not allow consent to become dogmatic, right? And so we're, like you said it, you named it, you said we're socialized to project our erotic at, right? Like the object of my attraction, the object of my adoration. And so I propose that we can be erotic with. We don't have to be erotic at, right? So, and it's how I experience it somatically is directional. So that there's, when we're projecting at, when we're taking our Eros and we're projecting it at someone and landing it on them or on something, right? Whether we have consent or not, that there's a kind of a linear directionality about that. And for folks who have penises, like that's often forward, right? And it can be very genital centric and it can be very intrusive sometimes, right? So what is it to be erotic with? And this is for both human and other than human. And I think is helpful when thinking about like, how do I be consensual with my Eros everywhere I go in the world? You know, if like, how do I be erotic with is like, oh, I can somatically, if I put my attention on it, I can take that erotic energy that might be really genitally focused and I can spread it out. I can spread it out to my whole body and I can spread it out behind me. I can spread it out above me. I can spread it out below me. I can root it into the earth. You know, that there's like, that I can just become like this beautiful energy ball of Eros, you know, that's not trying to land it on, you know, not trying to convince or persuade or negotiate. It's just like, hey, here I am in my beautiful Eros. I'm feeling the pleasure that's available even without any kind of stimulation, right? I can turn my attention to that. I can get nuanced enough to learn to do that. And then it's kind of a non-issue, like the consent thing, because I'm not trying to do anything with it. There's no agenda, right? I'm not trying to get to a goal. I'm just hanging out with my erotic, being with my sexy. And I do this when I'm out in the world all the time, out with people, out with nature, it's a different paradigm, I think, of really stepping into like, everywhere I go, I'm erotic and it's never trying to do a thing, right? Does that make sense? All right. So then you asked me the question. I totally riffed off of that. So you asked me about ecosexuality. Yeah. Well, first, I want to acknowledge Annie Sprinkle and Beth Stevens for their vast contribution to the paradigm around ecosexuality. I think it goes back again to what we were talking about when we were talking about sacred sites and how to approach this consensual piece is around that. It's a different way of inhabiting our soma when we decide that our sensuality or sexuality isn't just limited to other humans, right? When we're like, oh, I am going to have an erotic experience with this body of water, this river. I'm going to have an erotic experience with this tree, right? It's that deep listening. And one of the cool things that I have found is that it's pretty responsive. Like you can actually ask and be like, hey, okay to give you a hug, tree, and things will happen. Like the wind will blow or a needle will fall or, this stuff happens. And I think it's just polite also. Like it's a good protocol of just kind of getting out of extraction mindset and into collaborative mindset, right? Of just like asking like, oh, hey, I was on a walk in my neighborhood yesterday. Hey, tomato. My neighbors had tomatoes in their yard. Can I eat you? Like, is that okay? It's like, yeah, cool. Great. And then being okay to, it's a muscle. You have to build that trust of like listening, but then hearing no is also okay, right? Like, oh, cool. You're not into it today. And also like reciprocity, sacred reciprocity about the give back. When I was a baby witch, somebody trained me if you take something, make sure you leave something, offer some pee, offer some of your hair. If you have, just make sure that reciprocity is being tended, that those offerings are being made, even if it's just, whatever you have is fine. It's, you don't have to be all fancy about it. If you have a little bit of saliva in your mouth, like that's fine, like whatever it is, but just to really track for the give back. Yeah. That's what I want to say about that.
That piece of reciprocity and offering is so important. And I think when I learned about it, I didn't really understand how to ground that action of offering. And I think I thought it was more, I guess I didn't fully believe that it was real or something. And it took years of practicing and just going, okay, I'm going to do this. And maybe I'll feel silly. And maybe I'll feel like this isn't really connecting with this place. But time after time and year after year of sitting with it in the discomfort of breaking down my colonial, white supremacist, dominant culture conditioning and opening myself up and listening and doing those offerings time and time again. It's like, no, this is very real. This is extremely connecting. And so I love hearing you talk about it because it just floods me with all of my feelings. And I'm wondering, within this circle of reciprocity, how are we fundamentally changed by our relationship with wild places? And how are we open to the erotic and deepened in our capacity for unconditional love? And just to make a note on this unconditional love word, I honestly really didn't know what that was in an embodied way. I didn't understand it. I didn't grow up in a family that unconditional love was something that was given. And it wasn't until I was with the temperate rainforest and I fell so madly in love with this ecosystem, this place. And I remember the lust and the first, honeymoon stage, and I was just totally enraptured. And then the more that I spent time with the temperate rainforest as the drought came, and I would walk around these forest, whether it was, and they weren't all old growth. Actually, most was not old growth. There's only 2% old growth left globally. So the old growth was very scarce. And I'd go into these second growth and these plantation forests. And I'd be like, you're not old growth. Like, you're not what I fantasize about or my honeymoon phase is. And now and you're in drought and you're crunchy. And I remember having all of these feelings of rejection. And it took me time to be like, no. I love you whether you are crunchy in your drought. I love you if you are plantation forested. I love you regardless of what we have done to you, because I love you for you regardless of what you are, to quote me. And when I shifted that and I could just feel so madly in love with the forest, with where they're at exactly at this moment, within climate change and the Anthropocene and so much raping and pillaging of them and their ancestors, and to be able to feel that type of depth of love, that I'm not going anywhere regardless of what happens to you. I'm going to be by your side until the very end. The expansiveness of my chest, even saying that, is like nothing I've ever experienced in the human world. And so this topic of unconditional love for wild places, but also places that were once wild and have been in so many ways abused so badly, has been a huge teaching in my life. So that's my own personal story around it. But yeah, I'd love to just hear you speak about the depth of capacity for unconditional love with wild places or just the earth in general.
I feel blessed to hear your description of falling in love. It's my sense that if we want wild love, what we need to learn is to receive wild love. And wild love isn't perfect. And the places aren't perfect, right? They're not, like, when we fall in love with a human, we're not actually, for like the first 6 to 18 months, we're not actually in love with the person we think we are. We're in love with our love. We're in love with the set of sensations that we're having in our bodies. We're in love with the fact that we can feel this way. We're not actually in love with the person. And so when we actually fall in love with a person, when we fall deeply, deeply in sustainable long-term love, it's knowing that they are a hot mess and that they're going to be a hot mess until they die. That's what my partner said to me once when I was telling him that I was such a hot mess. He said, yeah, I love you and you're going to be a hot mess till you die. Like, that's unconditional love, right? And what can happen with the erotic when we go out into wild places that are not perfect, that have been harmed, that have been abused, is it can feel like if you open yourself to that really deep feeling, you're going to feel what has happened in that place, right? And that's hard. It's hard to feel that. It's hard to bear witness to it. It's hard to acknowledge it. And so, I think lots of folks can go and they can get turned on by the mating of the birds and the clouds in the sky. But like the kind of love that you're talking about, the unconditional love, it has to be inclusive of the whole situation. Like, what is, yeah? It's like there has to be no fear about opening to what is, because you trust your own resilience. You trust that I can erotically open to the aliveness of this place, no matter how harmed it is, or to this person, no matter how messed up they are. I can open fully. I can be with whatever is true there, whatever has happened, whatever they're feeling. Like, I can be with that. I'm not going to lose myself. Right? I'm not going to be swept away by that suffering, or I'm not going to be devastated and thrown into endless grief. Like, I might feel grief. We need to feel grief. We need to be, I think that that's such an important connection actually between the erotic and grief, of the willingness to feel grief and the willingness to feel grief about place, about relationship, about patriarchy, about oppression. The willingness to feel that deep grief is actually the thing that makes it relational. Right? I'm not afraid of your pain. I'm not afraid of your suffering. I'm not afraid of your trauma getting on me somehow and tainting me, right? I don't need this pure thing. I need the real thing. Yeah. And when we have that practice in place of like, I'm practicing my resilience for the sake of wild love, for the sake of connection with you, person, place, universe, right? I'm practicing my resilience. I'm practicing being okay. I'm practicing receiving. I'm practicing receiving pleasure, right? I'm not letting myself stay in this brittleness, this fragility that comes from pain, really, right? Like I can be in pain and I can be flexible. I can be generous and generative with my body and with my heart and with my Eros. Like that's, I feel like where that's that transcendent moment where you really belong and you're really not alone because like you are with, right? You've become the river. You've become the sky. You've become the forest. And there's not this, I mean, I think this is what death is actually this is what I'm praying for, that my death is going to be like, of like, I'm just with now. There's no separation, and that's, I mean, there's no separation and there doesn't need to be for any boundaries or safety. Like it's just okay to just surrender into this embrace.
Afternoon road, the eyes of smoke overhead, turned off down into the brush. Got out to walk, a face reflected for a moment, went to think across the Rio Grande. And swimming beside me, I wanted to tell you, but couldn't slide across the decades tonight. I'd take you to the Canyon River, put your feet out under the sky. There are traces in the air of your time laid bare, and you want to just let it by. Let it by.
This feeling of comfort and belonging that you have just expressed is so deeply nourishing. And I feel like so many of us, if not all of us, are praying and striving and sometimes clinging for that type of connection with another. And yeah, I'm thinking about our conversation today within the framework of belonging, and belonging within the body in an erotic sense, belonging as an earth connection, and belonging alongside ancestral or cultural kin. And I'm wondering how you're living within this inquiry of belonging as an ongoing practice or process.
Yeah, this has been my primary practice recently. And what feels really exciting is that other people have figured some of this stuff out. There's like technologies and things that are written about it and cultural practices. And I feel like there's a lot in the cultural conversation right now about belonging. I'm reading Bell Hook's book, Belonging, which is so amazing, and yeah. And so my practice is like, and again, I talk about sexual liberation as a set of practices, right? It's not this like state that you get to like, woohoo, now I'm sexually liberated. It's like, oh no, I'm a commitment to these practices. And I think that belonging is like that. If I feel like I'm not belonging, if I feel that sense of disbelonging, it's on me to practice something different, right? To be like, oh, okay, so this is what's happening right now. Okay, I'm going to do one of my belonging practices. I'm going to reach out to someone. I am going to go spend some time with my land. That there are things that we can actually do to increase that sense of belonging, and that there's personal things and there's also cultural things. There's group things, right? We can create communities of welcome. We can create oh gosh, I'm just thinking about when I took an improv class, and one of the things that they taught us was they'd be like, break up into groups of 3. And so then you have to do it in 10 seconds, really fast. And if anybody is not in a group, you're like, come, right? This, over here, come with us, and we can all practice that, right? And so if I'm feeling that sense of disbelonging, that I can become more inclusive. I can become more welcoming rather than, kind of feeling bereft or feeling left out. I can actually do things. So that's really exciting to me about belonging, that it's something that we can tend to within ourselves and within our communities. And I think it's pretty exciting to think about belonging to a place. Trees belong to a place. That tree, it just picks where it's going to live, and then that's just its place. And what is that like to make that commitment to a place? And whether or not you are living in that place all the time, like you said, I am with you. You're never going to leave those forests, right? Even if you're on the other side of the world, you're with those forests. You belong to that place. You know where you belong. Yeah. And we can do that. We can cultivate those practices of belonging to particular places where we feel the home feelings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's on us to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. My goodness, there's so much. And I feel the same way almost after every time you pause, because I feel like entire galaxies are expanding in my heart and in my mind of feeling so much complexity in myself and this longing to belong, this longing for unconditional love, this longing for a connection and a reciprocity that has been so stripped and in some ways stolen from our human experience. Maybe not in some ways, in multiple ways. And as our time together comes to a close, I'd love to hear more about how we might thread some of these practices of embodiment, deep listening, and ancestral exploration into our lives. How can we tend to these sacred relationships with the self and kin? What portals, whether that's plants, myths, storytelling, altars, animals, exist for creative animation in the everyday?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you just named a bunch of the practices, and they're going to be so different. They're going to be so unique for each person, right? And like we talked about earlier, they're definitely things that your ancestors practice. Eat the foods your ancestors ate. Do the things that they did. If they spun wool, spin wool and see what happens. I think that those are interesting kinds of things. I also just want to address practice itself. Practice gets a bad rap, from folks who have been through public school or been through music lessons or been through organized sports or organized religion that they hated, and you have to practice half an hour a day. And so when we talk about practices, when I talk about practices, I want to be just really careful to not further that you're not good as you are right now. You must do work to be good, and one of my mentors, Richard Strozzi, says you're always practicing something. You get to choose what you practice, right? And so practices really don't have to be these monolithic things that you do or don't do or get resistant about doing. A practice can appear in a moment, right? A practice can be just one real breath or one true thing that you say, or some people do really well with structured practice, but other people just get especially the anarchist crew just gets super resistant to it, right? And so I think holding a different paradigm of practice in which like really small amounts of conscious practice will yield you excellent results. And you don't, like to quote Mary Oliver, crawl on broken glass, right? You can just have a practice, make it conscious, and listen for that thing that's right inside you at that moment.
I really don't want this conversation to end. Being with you in this conversation is, in a way, it feels like I've been starving for this type of soulful food. And talking to you is like the best buffet. I don't know why I see it in terms of food. I just had lunch, so I shouldn't be that hungry. But there's this, just this longing to be able to connect around these topics so deeply. And you have such a gentle but potent way of describing these themes that are just so human. They're so us. And I really appreciate all the work that you must have done to be able to sit with these themes in the ways that you do and be able to then share them with the world and with all of the things that you do through your podcast and through your teachings. And thank you so much for being the person you are.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Itasca. I'd like to thank our team, Aidan McCrae, Andrew Storrs, Carter Lou McElroy, Erica Ekram, Aaron Wise, Francesca Glassfell, Hannah Wilton, Melanie Younger, and Suzanne Dollywall.